Steve Farnsworth, to my immediate right, is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs and Director of the Center for Leadership and Media Studies at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg. He's co-author and author of 5 books, most recently Global President, International Media, and the U.S. Government, which looks at international news coverage of the U.S. during the Obama and George W. Bush presidencies. Steve is also author or co-author of dozens of scholarly articles on the presidency, mass media, and U.S. public opinion, and of course, my favorite topic, Virginia politics. Thank you, Jim Caesar. Now, Steve Farnsworth.
Thank you, Bob. It's always great to be here for the Festival of the Book. I can't write a book every year, so I can't come every year, but I am glad when the book is done for several reasons, but one of them is that I get to talk about it with all of you. When much of my research focuses on media and politics, and it's always important, I think, for me to start with full disclosure. I used to be a reporter, and some of the papers that I worked for no longer exists, but I don't blame myself. I do come out of the print culture in terms of my own experiences as a reporter, and a lot of my research focuses on TV and television news, because television news has so much larger an audience. And even today, with so much focus on the internet, a lot of what you see online is derivative of what's already been in established media. For those of you who read the New York Times or the Washington Post, you might very well be reading it online, but if you don't, a lot of what's said online has to do with what was already in those mainstream media outlets online. And so what I've tried to do in this book is try to apply as scientific a technique as possible to look at media content. Human nature being what it is, we tend to remember stories that confirm what we already believe about the media. If we like Obama or if we don't like Obama, we'll remember those stories that match up with our own convictions about how media and politics work. And so what we did was we employed a small army of content analysts who are native speakers of German and of English and of Arabic to do a content analysis, basically a paragraph by paragraph study of all the conversation about the United States in international media. And so we looked at 5 Arabic language outlets, Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, which is connected to the Saudi royal family, Nile News of Egypt, the Lebanese Broadcasting Corporation, and Al Manar, which is connected to Hezbollah, which of course, as you know, is a terrorist organization, as identified by both the Obama and the Bush administrations before it. We also used 2 BBC broadcasts and 2 German state broadcasters. And so we're looking at basically the equivalent of the evening news in these various media outlets. We also have, for purposes of comparison, NBC, CBS, ABC, and Fox News. We, in order to look at this media content, we came up with a period of time that we could consider and still be able to come in reasonably close to our budget. But this project was so big. We originally started this book just going to talk about the Bush administration, but we added the Obama administration as we found that it took so long to get all the material together. But it's a pretty extensive database. We're looking at over 300,000 statements about these 2 presidents and about during the first 18 months of Obama's first term and then the first 18 months of Bush's second term. We didn't use the first 18 months of the first term because of 9/11, and that would dramatically change the results, of course. So it's not exactly an apples by apples comparison, but it does give us some sense of how the U.S. is seen internationally by these very influential media outlets, as well as some measure of comparison for how the U.S. was seen with these 2 different presidents. For the U.S. media, we also looked at their coverage of the presidents in international context, and there were 80,000 statements during those same 2 18-month periods. So we're looking at a decent amount of data, and that explains why I've been at it for so long. My co-authors and I start with the finding that there is very little coverage of the world in American media, and there is much more coverage of the world beyond the home country in almost every other media outlet that we looked at. I mean, one of the problems that you see with respect to American domestic media, and this may be why international concerns do not play all that prominent role in a lot of American elections, and why Americans may not have the appreciation for the complexity of the international environment sometimes, is because they're not really given a lot of information. And part of that, of course, is the fact that reporters are going to cover what people want to hear. And with modern technology, we know that there's not that much of an online audience for international news. And so we know that, that the audience is much greater for American news. But given that very American focus, when we do cover things internationally, we usually cover two kinds of things. One, countries where the U.S. is invaded or occupying, like Iraq and Afghanistan. Or two, some country that has some really dramatic crisis or controversy going on. So we had, for example, a lot of coverage of of Haiti after the earthquake. We had a lot of coverage of the Chilean miners. You may recall they were stuck for months underground. We have, of course, an expert on the Vatican here today. We also had a lot of coverage when there's a new pope. Controversies, constant questions there. So when you look at the U.S. news as we are seen around the world, a couple of things pop out, and we can talk more about these during question and answer. But one of the first things to remember is that the coverage of the U.S. is not as negative as you might think. A lot of coverage about the U.S. doesn't deal with the things that we imagine it deals with. Well, obviously the international news outlets have a lot of critical information to say about Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo or how difficult it is to get a visa to come to the U.S., those kinds of topics, as you might expect. But we also have a lot of coverage of the U.S. as it relates to culture and sports, and that conversation is very, very positive. The United States does pretty well internationally in just about everything but soccer when it comes to sports, and culturally, even though you might think the Europeans might look down on our mass cultural offerings, the truth is that we are treated pretty positively around the world for our culture, be it film, be it music, be it the arts, otherwise. Overall, when you compare the coverage in different countries, we found a very surprising result that related to Europe versus the Arabic language media. The coverage, you might expect, from the countries that were NATO allies, the countries that went with us into Afghanistan, some of them also into Iraq with us, was much, much more critical during both the Bush administration years and the Obama administration years than the Arabic language media. The Arabic language media was much more positive as a whole, or less negative, depending on which cycle we're looking at, than the European media. And so the countries that perhaps know us best, that we think is having shared cultural understandings with us, are actually much more critical of us than the Arabic language media. And so this was a very unexpected finding that we saw as we looked at this. When we looked at the individual media outlets, we were really interested in the question of whether the U.S. and its public diplomacy efforts are really going in the right direction. Among the media outlets that I mentioned, Al Arabiya has always been treated very, very well by U.S. foreign policy makers. They're very interested in selling the case of America through Al Arabiya. And that's, of course, the Saudi royal family, often relatively well connected to the United States. And so the theory was that there would be positive treatment. In fact, Al Jazeera, which is so often criticized by American media and American political figures, is much more positive towards the United States than Al Arabiya. So we're actually focusing on the wrong horse, if you will, in terms of our story being told. And again, the coverage was more positive for Obama in every case than for Bush, and with all the international media, as you might expect. But the one thought that I would leave you with is we actually wondered about this Hezbollah, Al-Manar, the voice of a terrorist organization, and how their coverage was of the United States. And it was actually pretty close to neutral. It wasn't as critical as you might think. And in comparison, I'll leave you with one comparison with respect to Al-Manar, the Hezbollah voice, and American media. We found that Al-Manar was less critical of Barack Obama than Fox News. So if Fox News is in the market for another slogan, we can offer up the idea of America's Hezbollah as a motto for the coverage. But with that, I will say thank you.